most people think tree planting as a feel-good experience, as a feel-good thing to do, and corporates put it on their website. Yes, we planted 1 million trees, we planted 5 million trees. But the reality is that has nothing to do with planting. Planting is effectively not the solution. Growing is the solution. How many trees have you grown to maturity and how can you prove it? It's like having a child produce 10 kids, right? Where are these kids? What are they doing? What kind of education are they getting? How are they playing a positive role in society? That's the fundamental question we should be asking. Same with tree planting. What mechanism have you in place to ensure that this tree will be there in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years?
Vahid, I'm really grateful for you to spend some time with me here on the Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation podcast. For folks who are unfamiliar with you and the work that you do, would you mind briefly introducing us?
Sure. Thank you, Corey, for having me on your podcast. My name is Vahid Fotuhi. I'm the founder and CEO of Blue Forest, which is a mangrove forest restoration and conservation development vehicle, which means we typically identify mangrove forests that require healing, and we work with the communities that live alongside those forests to work together on putting in place solutions that address the short-term risks and challenges that those forests are facing and put in place programs to ensure their long-term health and survival.
Mm. Well, thank you for that, and I'll be excited to get into more detail about specifically the reforestation projects themselves, as well as talking about the wonders of the mangrove trees. But first, Vahid, I'd love to know what brought you into this work with Blue Forest. From what I understand, this is a relatively newer organization, but you have spent some considerable time in the space of sustainability and renewable energy specifically. But to chart the course a little bit for us, why does Blue Forest make sense for you right now as what you're starting to dedicate your time, energy, and capacities towards?
Sure. Indeed, it is a relatively new organization, and it kind of happened in an evolutionary fashion. I started in the energy sector and then realized that, the world is warming up and that, we have to look at sustainable energy and shifted to renewables and got to experience a lot of cool projects in kind of emerging markets in Asia and particularly in Africa. And the work enabled me to spend a lot of quality time in rural communities and remote environments in Africa, and I was able to see some of the challenges that those communities are facing, and also come face to face with a lot of deforestation that was happening by virtue of the fact that people just needed to feed their families, and basically cut the trees to achieve that goal, and how it was ultimately unsustainable. Oops, sorry, light here. And so I decided to kind of look into ways where we could address some of these needs for communities and families to provide a livelihood for their children, and at the same time do it in a way that is sustainable for the forests. And there's a lot of reforestation activities and initiatives around the world. It's kind of like a flavor of the day these days. But what I realized was that there was fundamentally a flaw in the way reforestation is generally carried out around the world. In that ultimately, and this is not the case for all reforestation programs, there are certainly exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, reforestation projects that we see are kind of a numbers game where they basically try to plant as many trees as possible for as lowest cost as possible. And this ultimately ends up in a quality issue, and that the projects are not carried out sustainably They're not methodically thought through, and certainly there's no maintenance and kind of evaluation that's associated with these projects. And what this means is that, the survival rate of all these projects is quite low. A lot of these poor trees die because there is no post planting care. And so I was thinking to myself, there must be a better way to do this. There must be a way where you could find sources of funding and financing for reforestation projects that are long term in nature, that do have the kind of the big picture in mind, and the kind of the 30-year horizon that a tree really needs to blossom. And that's when I came to know about what's known as the voluntary carbon credit markets, which effectively is a marketplace where those effectively who are polluting the world are looking for ways that offset the amount of emissions that they cannot retract from their natural existing technologies, and that they just cannot cut down. So they're looking to offset it by helping fund reforestation activities in other markets. And this market is in fact growing, and there are more and more players, both on the demand side and the supply side, taking part in this with the ultimate aim of effectively planting more trees and restoring more forests over the long term. And when I came across this marketplace, I thought to myself, this is fantastic. We now have an opportunity, a vehicle to be able to fund projects for the long term. And since there is no dedicated company looking after mangroves, I said, let me start one up. And that's when Blue Forest was founded. And it's been an amazing adventure ever since.
Hmm. Well, I'm looking forward to diving deeper into some of the initial projects and as well why the selection for mangrove trees and restoring mangrove forests. But Vahid, I'm curious how this all connects. Uh, One, it seemed like most of your career was working in energy predominantly, right? And solar specifically, or a large portion of your career with solar. Um, and then too, you have a book of published photography from your travels around Africa. I think it was 25 or so countries you listed there. What's the how are you developing all these skill sets? How do you feel like there's overlap together? How did you have time to publish a book of your photographic work and spend so much time traveling around the continent?
Yes, good question. Good question, Corey. I wish I could say I had like a master plan from the beginning, but I really didn't. I mean, I studied energy and geopolitics at university, and that's in part because I was born in Iran, and I had to leave the country under very harsh circumstances, very dramatic circumstances, because it was a war, and I was in the middle of the war with my family, and there was kind of conscription going place where young boys would be conscripted into the military, and most often they would not come back. And we had to leave, we had to flee the country very, kind of very abruptly to escape that, imminent death. And it was all induced effectively, for a struggle between Iran and Iraq over oil resources. It was really oil induced, and that really kind of created a fascination for me between the role of oil and geopolitics and conflict. And this is what I studied and became really fascinated. And it was fortunate to eventually get hired by BP, which had its own roots in Iran. And so it seemed like a perfect combination. I was really enjoying the oil sector and all the, at the time, all the kind of the aura that went with it. But at the same time, I witnessed two major disasters. One, which was the Texas City refinery explosion, which I'm not sure if you remember that, but that was a huge explosion on a refinery in Texas that led to the loss of a lot of lives. And not long after that, you had the Gulf of Mexico disaster, which resulted in even more loss of lives and a huge damage to the environment. And this combined with the fact that I had just become a father, and I just brought to the world my first son, it was a kind of like a wake up moment for me, whereby I asked myself, what is my contribution to this planet? What kind of world am I creating for my son? And that's when I realized that I want to be part of the solution. I don't want to be part of the problem. And so I shifted from oil and focused on solar, and to try to develop renewable sources of energy so that we could peel away from fossil fuels. And at the time, it was a nascent industry, particularly here in the Middle East, which is really predominantly oil and gas driven. But I saw the potential. I could see the fundamentals shifting towards renewables. And so I started working solar. I started the Solar Association for the Middle East and really created a kind of movement. And 10 years later, it was become the largest solar movement across Middle East and North Africa, something that I had not anticipated. But by bringing people together, we were able to create that kind of force for good. And as I started to develop these renewable projects, I was shifting further away from home, increasingly into Africa, where there was huge, vast lands where you could actually build these vast solar power plants and provide electricity where there's currently no kind of power being provided. And that got me into some fantastic countries such as Uganda, Egypt, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and others, where I was able to kind of get into these communities and kind of work with them on finding a solution using solar power. And on many of the times, I'd be traveling by myself, in part because no one wanted to come with me to these really remote places, because they were afraid of malaria, they were afraid of like yellow fever, all sorts of dangers, which is probably they probably had good reason. But I was like, let's go out there and see what we can find. And being by myself and kind of having a lot of idle time, I started to kind of experiment taking photos of the different things I saw. And being in these really remote locations and exposed to very unique environments, you got to see some amazing sights and witness amazing experiences, which I captured. And down the road, I actually compiled into a photography book. And Corey, I'd be happy to kind of give you a copy of that book. But effectively, it's kind of a kind of a journal of my adventures in Africa, spanning across 23 countries, from north, south, east, and west, in different communities with different, different people. And it was a wild, wild era. Something that is one of the highlights of my life, and something that I hold very close to my heart. And yeah, after that, I continued along the sustainability space. With the kind of solar renewable market maturing, I decided to take on something that's more closely related to climate change, and that is using nature-based solution to enhance our climate adaptation, particularly through reforestation. And that's what's brought me to where I am today.
Hey y'all, Corey here. We're going to take a quick break to hear a word from our sponsor. Holden Rings, where I got my very own wedding ring, is excited to launch its new Pride collection in support of the Trevor Project. Celebrate the gem that you are and choose a color that represents you, and wear your support of Trevor with pride. $50 of every purchase is donated to the Trevor Project, the world's largest suicide prevention and crisis intervention organization for LGBTQ plus young people. Holden donates 1% of sales year round to the Trevor Project and are excited to amplify their work with this newest collection. Holden's gender neutral rings are made with recycled precious metals and ethical lab grown diamonds. And Holden is a climate neutral certified company, meaning that they measure and offset 100% of their carbon emissions. Every ring is custom made to order in New York City, and Holden offers a lifetime guarantee on all rings. Holden is offering a custom discount for listeners of the Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation podcast. You can take $30 off your order with Holden by using the code GROW30. That's GROW30. Check out their collection at highholden.com or follow them on social media at Holden Rings. Again, don't miss that discount, $30 off for listeners of our show with the code
Grow 30.
And so what awareness? I know, or I don't know the ages of your kids. I know you have a few more than just that first one you mentioned there now. But what awareness do your kids have now to the transition that you made professionally, where it seems like you made this big shift in purpose, and then as well to the extent of that very, very extensive adventure and exploration of all those different countries. Do they have a big awareness of what sort of shifts you made?
I hope so. And as you'll see as a father, you do your best to have a positive impact on your children and to really kind of kind of lead the way by example. And that's certainly what I've tried to do by kind of embracing solar energy, renewables, teaching them about solar power. I got them involved as we installed solar panels on our roof. We were one of the first homes in Dubai to be solar powered, and something that they were themselves very proud of. I got them to be to understand about the importance of using like energy efficient light bulbs, and to to embrace LED, to understand the harms of single use plastic and how avoiding single use plastic is so important. To really try to make them eco warriors, and to some extent it certainly worked. They're kind of more mindful about the environment, about conservation, about recycling, reusing, embracing electric vehicles. And I think that to a large extent, I have been able to, you know, leave an impact on their lives and to kind of shape their upbringing. And for that, I'm really, really, really happy about.
Hmm, I can imagine. And is there any sort of explicit tactic or strategy in your communication as a parent with them around that, to make them, as you mentioned there, eco warriors?
I guess it's repetition. It's repetition. You basically have to, be consistent in your practices and in your behavior. You know, when it comes to recycling, you have to consistently recycle. You have to consistently use LED light bulbs. You have to consistently uh, recognize and point out areas for improvement in their behavior, about using public transport, about cutting down on fossil fuels, about identifying areas where they could be more sustainable. And it's not like a single solution, but it is more about a journey, and to continuously accompanying them on the journey, and to always kind of point out elements of this journey so that it's a holistic experience, and it becomes part of their lifestyle.
Hmm. What are their ages now?
The eldest is now 16. He's the first one. I cannot believe it's already 16 years have passed, and he's now an adult. And you know, it's it does flash by. To be honest, it does flash by. They say it, and then you realize that shit, they were right. It does flash by. And the middle one's almost 14. The youngest one's 11. And the beauty of having more than one child is that inevitably their personalities are different. Some will be more embracing of what you're teaching versus others, and so you get to see it from different perspectives, and you get to kind of identify, kind of spot what drives them, and as much as possible to kind of feel their passion, feel their curiosity, just like I was curious and I feel my own curiosity. I'm trying to do the same for my kids. you know I dabbled with the idea of kind of bringing them to remote communities in Africa. Didn't work. It didn't work. I mean, if they stop where the Wi-Fi stops, effectively. If there's no Wi-Fi, they're not interested. That is kind of the children of today, and I respect that. So you learn as a parent to pick your battles.
Hmm. Vahid, it sounded like you were surprised with the momentum that uh, the renewable energy movement got in your work, both in the Middle East and it sounds like throughout the rural communities that you visited in the African countries. What do you think led to the success and momentum of that kind of caught you by surprise?
I think ultimately you have to kind of follow your intuition. At that time, I could see the potential. I could see that it was not economical to use fossil fuels to power your buildings and to use it for electricity generation, because solar power could solve that problem much more efficiently, and particularly if you do it at scale. And so you really have to follow your understanding of the subject matter and to drive it home. And at that point, having had kind of an education in economics and market fundamentals, I was able to use the underlying market rules of supply and demand to be able to anticipate where the markets were headed, and to be part of that drive. I can see that it was not economical to burn fossil fuels for power generation. It would have they would have to learn to love solar because it's just much more economical. And inevitably, if you point on the facts, if you point out the facts, they will kind of come to light, and then see the merits of your argument, and kind of embrace it and follow you as as in making that case. And so I was able to do that, successfully in the Middle East, and then successfully in Africa with several projects, unveiled and successfully commissioned, initially in the field of solar power, and then in the field of wind power, which I was really excited about. And I'm very excited about kind of replicating the same success and the same example in the field of using climate finance to fuel and to grow um, forest protection and forest restoration activities at a large scale.
Mm. Well, yeah, let's start to dive in there, and perhaps set the foundation with your tree of choice, which has been the mangrove. Can you explain for us, Vahid, just to make sure that we're all on the same page? Um, One, what is a mangrove, just so we can kind of visualize here in our head what kind of tree that is, and what forest we might imagine. And then as well, why are they so important, and particularly unique in the context of nature-based solutions to climate adaptation?
Sure. Well, I like to describe mangroves as effectively, the underdog of the forestry sector. For one, people don't actually think mangroves are trees; they think they're shrubs. They certainly look like shrubs. They don't necessarily have that beautiful, long, you know, heroic looking, profile that a tree has. You don't see them on any dollar bills. You don't see them being used very often as logos. They're not pretty. From certainly from afar, they're not pretty. They don't look particularly inviting, and typically dark. So it's not really like you would think of them as a forest or something as a tree. And that was the experience for myself. We go to like Thailand or Malaysia, and we see these mangrove forests. It seemed like a spooky, dark area, which was kind of like a freak of nature. Certainly not a forest, but because I kind of having grown up in Canada and being surrounded by trees and forests, I was naturally yearning for kind of a similar experience here in the Middle East. And of course, being surrounded by sand, there's not that many trees around, understandably. But luckily, along the coastline, you do find mangrove forests. And so, thanks to my passion for kind of trees and all things green, I was kind of attracted to these mangrove forests here in Dubai to kind of think, check them out and see what's going on, and get to go inside them, kayak through them. And I realized, oh, wow, these are actually pretty beautiful, beautiful forests, and there's actually a lot of action in these forests, both in terms of like bird life, fishing, animals. There's a whole party happening in these mangrove forests that I had not been aware of, and it's quite alluring. And also, you can already see from a climate impact how, as you go through through a mangrove forest, it's a cooler environment because it keeps the temperatures down compared to an area where there is no trees and certainly no mangroves. And so, as you look through the water, you can see, an entire world of fish that are there, because the fish actually lay their eggs inside the roots of the mangrove trees, and it serves as a nesting environment for fish to spawn. And this is why whenever there's mangroves, there's a lot of fishing activity. And this is what's the beautiful part about mangroves is that it's the only tree that could actually grow in water. That it doesn't need to be on dry land all the time. It in fact needs tidal water for it to actually blossom. And it can also be found in over 100 countries, which are tropical or subtropical. So it's much more widely dispersed than you would think. But at the same time, it's also quite a finite resource. If you look at the entire forest wealth of the world, the forest footprint of the total footprint of forests in the world, only 3% represent mangrove forests. So it's a very small percentage of the total forest uh, reserves that we have, which represent mangroves. But nevertheless, in many countries, they are seen as the guardians of the coast because they help shield those communities against natural disasters such as cyclones and tsunamis. And so, whilst they may be finite and little, they certainly play a oversized role, both in terms of biodiversity for fish, for birds, for animals, as well as in terms of providing protection for coastal communities. And a third superpower that they have, as it turns out, is that they're a great source of carbon capture. They're able to sequester 5 to 10 times, depending on the species of mangrove, more carbon dioxide than conventional terrestrial trees. And so, for every 1 ton per hectare that you're able to capture and sequester from a normal forest, a same forest the size would be able to sequester 5 tons. So you're getting a lot more, carbon capture per hectare through these wonderful mangrove forests than you would from a terrestrial forest. And at a time where climate change is more important than ever, and our efforts to capture and to sequester these harmful, nasty pollutants from the air into the ground, then the mangrove tree becomes your front line in this campaign, in this battle, as it sucks in more carbon than any other tree and is able to sequester it for over 1,000 years. And because of these wonderful characteristics that this tree has, for me, it's a no-brainer to empower the tree, to kind of become a champion of the tree, and to help it blossom, and to, at the very least, prevent it from getting deforested. Because the sad truth is that we have lost half of all the world's mangrove forests due to deforestation. 50% has already disappeared. And I've seen it with my own eyes. It's very sad. You go to areas, entire you can see entire landing strips from 747s that used to be mangroves that have just been slashed and cut down in many countries. And we've lost half of our mangrove resources already. And every year we're losing 1% of the remaining mangrove forests. And so conceivably in 50 years, there will be no more mangroves, which means, you know, the coastlines will be bare, exposed. There'll be no more fish. There'll be no more birds. It's a really, really sad scenario. And I'm just doing my part to kind of raise awareness and to A, stop the deforestation from happening, and B, where it has happened, work together hand in hand with the communities to restore those forests and to protect them, for many more years to come.
Hmm. And so, is it strictly development building as to why we are losing mangroves at such a rate, or are there any other kind of more complex reasons, economic or otherwise, why those forests are being diminished?
It's a typical human trait where effectively populations are growing everywhere, particularly in developing countries. They're growing at a faster rate than kind of developed countries. And as it turns out, most of these forests are in fact in developing countries, in southern countries where the need for development and the need for livelihood is more acute. And as a result, when the government doesn't provide, opportunities, and when the private sector doesn't have opportunities, and they live alongside a, forest that has trees, and there is a marketplace for those trees, particularly in the
Mm.
form of charcoal or construction material, then, the obvious thing to do, I think, Corey, you and I would do the same thing. We just basically take the axe and go to town. We basically cut the trees so we can make some money at basically no cost, and help improve our livelihood, feed our children, and to gotta get a better life that all of us want and deserve, because there's no other alternatives.
Mm.
But this pattern is all fundamentally unsustainable. And unless kind of programs and measures are put in place, people are just going to keep cutting. They're going to keep cutting, and in fact, it's going to grow at a rapid pace because, through kind of the zero sum game um, approach, people realize that if they don't cut it, their neighbor will, and he or she will benefit. So it's almost like a race to the finish, where people are cutting the trees more aggressively and for bigger purposes. It's no
Mm.
longer just for charcoal or for building materials. Now they're using slash and burn approaches to clear entire fields, so as to build crab farms, fish farms, chicken growing farms, to do salt ponds, all sorts of more commercial, larger scale ventures that are more kind of commercially rewarding, but also from a biodiversity point of view, much more harmful. And
Mm.
this is happening. It's happening all over the world, not just one country in a region, happening everywhere. And this is why I'm
Mm.
trying to accelerate my work to kind of provide more sustainable solutions for these communities, so as to prevent these wonderful forests from getting cut down.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's maybe the some of the most interesting nuance of reforestation projects, as tree planting very broadly is becoming more popular and mainstream. It seems like it's something that's tagged on to all sorts of small little commercial initiatives of people planting a tree for this transaction, this purchase of this product, or kind of any other sort of exchange. Oftentimes to incentivize or kind of sweeten the deal, more so in a marketing and kind of conversion standpoint in the business world on occasion, or fundraising standpoint. And so it seems like both there's just the aspect of the actual repopulating these forests, but then it seems like very very critically important is essentially turning the faucet off on this rapid deforestation that's happening, continuing to plant trees, but also having to really mind, what is the origin of the issue, why people are cutting them down, why they are needing them for other purposes than, what seems to be our environmental and so many other list of benefits.
Absolutely. Honestly, I think tree planting is fundamentally flawed. I think most people think tree planting as a feel good experience, as a feel good thing to do, and corporates, like to, put it on their website. Yes, we planted, 1 million trees. We planted 5 million trees. But the reality is that it has nothing to do with planting. Planting is effectively not the solution. Growing is the solution. How many trees have you grown to maturity, and how can you prove it? It's like having a child. Anyone can say, yeah, I get, I produced 10 kids, right? Where are these kids? What are they doing? What kind of education are they getting? How are they being a positive? How are they playing a positive role in society? That's the fundamental question we should be asking. Same with tree planting. It's like, what mechanism have you in place to ensure that this tree will be there in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? How are you going to make sure that someone's going to look after it? Who's going to pay for the post planting care? These questions are not answered by those who are doing the planting and those who are funding the planting activities. All they want is a little sticker saying, "Yeah, I planted a tree," or "I planted 10 million trees." And I think, luckily, we do have a solution. It is not, universally accepted solution, but the voluntary carbon markets is a solution. Effectively, the way I see it, the voluntary carbon market is an effective channel to fund capital from the polluters to the protectors. And whether you like it or not, there's no better marketplace that can do this. And it's much better to look at how we could tweak it, perfect it, and make it more successful and more efficient then to kind of basically try to smear it and say it doesn't work. I work in this day and night. I could tell you it does work, and I think more and more people should embrace it, particularly at the community level, as a way of not only improving their livelihood, but also as a way of protecting their forests for the long term. Because frankly, there's no other way of doing it.
Mm. Well, let's get into that more specifically with Blue Forest's approach. First, to paint a picture of it, what are the current projects that y'all are working on, and as well, how, using those examples, perhaps, do you secure those projects, and as well, get the bid essentially, to be the provider, the reforestation expert, on the ground.
Yes, I look at it as almost like a dating game. You're basically you see this. If you're a girl, you see this hot guy. You're like, oh, he's really cute. I really want to go out with him. you know, you start exchanging messages. You go on a couple of dates. You start seeing. They start kind of assessing you out in terms of commitment. Is this guy serious? Is he willing to commit for the long term? They make you jump through a couple of hoops to see that you have the commitment and the resources to deliver for the long term. And if they see that you do, then they tie the knot. Fundamentally, project origination works the same way for forestry. You first have to identify the acute opportunities, which are areas where there are forests that require healing and that has potential for carbon credits. Then you have to do the courting game, where you basically have to speak with the forestry officials and explain to them the potential, outline to them your capabilities and your commitment to assisting them in putting in place the measures. They'll make you jump through some hoops. They'll make you do feasibility studies. They'll make you do, ecological baseline surveys. They'll make you do stakeholder mapping, to really to assess you out, make sure you're serious and that you have the bandwidth and the funding required. And you do this, you come back with a roadmap. You show me if you're really serious. You want to do this for the long term. You want to tie the knot. And if your business plan is sound, then they will tie the knot with you. And that's been my experience, to be honest, Corey. I know it's a bit, unorthodox as an example, but that's been my approach to project initiation to demonstrate that you can deliver value, to put in place a long-term roadmap, and to show them that you're able to, deliver on your commitments. And in the case of reforestation, that involves feasibility studies, ecological surveys, stakeholder mapping in areas where there's need for reforestation and conservation, and to just build partnerships over time. It's not something you can do overnight. It's 6-12 months of hard work and a lot of tea drinking, a lot of time in shabby hotels in remote places with bad Wi-Fi, crusty pillows, showers that don't work, all sorts of stuff in your room. Like, just it's not comfortable, but you got to push your limits. You got to go outside your comfort zone to demonstrate commitment, and it pays off. It pays off, and certainly that's been the approach that we at Blue Forest have adopted. And as a result of this approach, we've been able to forge partnerships in several countries, such as in Kenya, in Mozambique, in Gabon, in Cote d'Ivoire, um, as well as in some countries in Asia, such as Indonesia, Myanmar, and soon we're going to be expanding in Latin America, going to places like Mexico and Brazil, and all of them with the same goal in mind, which is to halt the sources of mangrove deforestation and to put in place livelihood programs that help provide the communities with better sources of you know livelihood, which then enables them to kind of be able to appreciate their forests and to conserve their mangrove forests.
Mm. And so, one of those projects, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in Mozambique, that's perhaps the largest mangrove reforestation project underway in Africa. Is that right?
Yes, and that's been like a gold mine of an opportunity that's kind of like just unraveled in the most beautiful way. And Mozambique has one of the largest mangrove forests in the world. There's a single tract that measures almost 200,000 hectares. and that's currently kind of being deforested, which in turn is making the coastline a lot more um, vulnerable. And year and a half ago, they had this massive cyclone that hit them, which resulted in over $2 billion in damages. Very painful, very painful. The country is now mindful of the importance that their mangrove forests represent, and they're putting in place programs and partnerships to protect and restore those forests. And we were fortunate enough to be, you know, considered and invited to forge one of those partnerships. And so we're restoring an area that's about 185,000 hectares. It's a huge, huge area. If you add up New York, Paris, and London, you would fit all of these three metropolises within our project area. It's massive. And it has the potential to sequester 3 million tons of CO2 annually in that one project. And so it is effectively the largest blue carbon, the largest mangrove project now in the world. And we're just having so much fun, bringing it, developing it.
Mm. And so, what did the timeline look like? What does the timeline look like on projects like that? I imagine there's a whole list of milestones and things to check in on. But is it open ended? We're going to continue to check in, every so often, whatever increment, or is it something like, we have this very hard milestone 10 years from now, but because that just has me wonder about the long-term repercussions of exactly what we've talked about with reforestation projects. How do they sustain and how do they continue to be managed and protected?
Sure. Well, with these reforestation projects, there's always a defensive play and an offensive play, right? You start with defense. You start by defending the trees that are still in the ground. These trees have been there for over 1,000 years. They're sequestering, you know, hundreds of tons of CO2. You want to defend, you want to protect them from getting cut down. And so the first thing you do is what's called avoided deforestation, and that effectively it means understanding, why people are cutting the trees in the first place, and putting in place programs, livelihood programs, such as providing them with other jobs, other sources of income, so that they don't cut this poor tree down. So that's defense, and that's the first thing that we do. We go in there, we sit down with the community, and collectively we identify what are the solutions to protect those forests, and we put in place those programs. And these are over long terms, 30-year programs that have to be put in place to make sure that what's there remains there. Then, once you've got the defensive game down, you go into offense, right? You do basically a topographical survey to look at the land that's been deforested. You do a hydrological study to see what are the streams, what are the flows of water, what are the tidal conditions. There's a lot of science involved. You do, biodiversity analysis to look at what are the species of mangroves that have existed, to ensure that you plant only indigenous species of mangroves. And as part of this ecological survey, you come up with a reforestation strategy to identify, where you're going to build a nursery, where you're going to grow seedlings, who's going to do the planting, how you're going to plant them, how you're going to monitor them, and ensure that the survival rate is 70, 80% to demonstrate success. And again, the community is very much on the front line. They're the ones who are doing the planting. They're the ones who are monitoring. One of the cool things that we do as part of our knowledge transfer agenda is we use drones to do the surveillance and to do the monitoring. But we don't just bring, drones, into these countries and say, hey, here's a cool gadget, you operate it. We're like, no. We actually go to these countries and we develop domestically made drones, locally made drones, using talent, the engineering talent that exists, and providing the sensors and the little core components that are needed to develop the drones from scratch, so that you basically develop manufacturing capabilities in country, and then you provide them with the skills to operate and monitor these machines that they've built, so that they can carry out, you know, you know, surveillance over the mangrove forest and to produce reports about their health and about the success rates. And it's always very popular because people love flying drones and they love basically to learn new skills. And so this is one of the ways we kind of use reforestation to instill and to provide new skill set into these communities and provide them the know-how that they could apply to forestry and then extend to other industries as well. And it's frankly, really rewarding and really long term because when you're there, these contracts, these carbon contracts are typically 20, 30 years, and you're incentivized to make sure that for 20, 30, 40 years, these trees remain in the ground and the trees that you've planted continue to grow and to blossom, which is really, one of the key elements about the structure that enables you to, and developers and the community members to have the trees and the forests, you know, at the heart of what they do, and to ensure that that they're safeguarded for the long term.
Mm. Well, what's the maturation timeline for a mangrove tree?
Minimum 10 years. Minimum 10 years. You want to really look after the tree for 10 years, to get over that 10-year hurdle. And after 15 years, I think the tree is on its way. So fully mature, I think, is 15 and above, and you want to look after it for at least 10 years.
Mm. And so it seems like there's, I mean, you've reiterated multiple times an important component of, finding who your local stakeholders are, and as well, as you said, and just from the livelihood component, that's a critical component to turning the faucet off on the deforestation in your defensive phase from the beginning. But are there? I mean, what sort of approaches are you taking to find local stakeholders or community members? Do you find that's explicitly necessary, and like who do you look for? Is it outside the realm of strictly the governing bodies in that those various municipalities? Like who are you looking to get in contact with to help build connection with the local communities that you're working in?
Sure. Um, so in this sense, It was very similar to what I was doing in the solar era when I was building solar power plants. There too, you have to first figure out where you're going to plant this solar project. Who's going to provide the land, and who's going to provide the skill set. And this typically starts with town halls, typically under a baobab tree or some sort of outdoor community area where everyone kind of gets together and starts talking and ultimately work towards consensus. And so the same consensus building approach that I used when I was building solar power plants, I'm using to effectively put in place forest restoration programs where you get to someone helps you identify who are the tribal leaders. The tribal leaders bring the community together. They kind of oversee the deliberations, and they kind of help the discussions come together. People are given a chance to voice their concerns, their wishes, and then over time, you kind of put in place a roadmap to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to, intervene. Here are the programs that we're going to be setting in place. And the community will say, well, we want to basically adopt more sustainable fishing practices. So we need kind of better nets or better boats, or we need more techniques, or we want to basically set up a fish farm. So we need this technology. We need dredging, or we want to build a crab growing farm. So we're going to need some technology and some know-how, some capital to build it. We've had interest in harvesting honey in one of our projects in Kenya. So we had to bring beehives and help them install the beehives and to basically do the harvesting of honey, which we could then bottle and sell from the community members, so they can make money. And so there's several different businesses that you can help set up that are locally self-sustaining and which provide the community members with a source of livelihood. You know, one of the areas we're working in Mozambique, we're going to build, a big promenade over the mangrove forest and put little kiosks for people to sell, little widgets or, sell, meals, set up a cafe, so as to bring ecotourism into the area, so as to provide people with sources of livelihood, so that they can see the forest as a source of income, as being a standing forest rather than anything else. And so there's many different ways where the community could identify solutions and Blue Forest or the developer provides them with the funding and the training and the skills required to bring those programs to life.
Mm. I mean, these seem like wildly complex projects. I mean, if it's, the one variable in one project where you're now starting these small honey businesses as an example, I'm sure that all those variables continue to exist no matter whether these projects are in one country or another. There's all these different intricate working parts. How are these, maybe one, a really crystal clear roadmap is very important, but how are these projects so effectively managed, especially given the fact that that there will be these variables that come up, especially on the timeline of 10, 20, 30 years?
Look, it's not for the faint of heart. Project development is not for the faint of heart, particularly in the field of reforestation and particularly in developing countries such as Africa or Asia. I mean, you wanna you wanna really be going in there, with your eyes wide open and ready for some adventure, because typically what can go wrong will go wrong, and you'll have to just figure it out. But if you have a long term approach to it and you just basically say, look, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and get it done, you will find a solution because the willingness is often there and the solutions are typically there. You just need to be patient, committed, and have a long term approach. And if you go in there with a long term approach and can do a mentality, when things do go wrong, and as they inevitably do, you adapt. You adapt your model, you adapt your solution set, and you find something that is more resilient and more sustainable. And so it's really a question of mindset and having the right approach. And if you do go in with the right approach and a long term strategy, you will ultimately prevail.
Mm. Hmm. And are there any kind of current limitations that you're seeing in your project strategy currently? Like any problems that you're looking to solve, um, or do you feel quite confident currently with your framework? Like, what is the limitation? Strictly just the quantity of projects for you see as Blue Forest, or where is the perceived bottleneck, both in you're providing the service or as well getting the opportunities to do so and take on these projects?
Yeah, I mean, every project has its own nuances and it has its own problems that you have to deal with. Um, with communities, of course, one of the often challenges is that if you go into a community and you're successful at providing benefits for that community and they help protect the forest, the neighboring community says, "What the hell? How come they're getting all this good stuff? I'm not."
Mm,
And you either have to extend the benefits or they're going to come and destroy the guy's forest.
mm,
Because it is, again, a zero sum game, and people are just like that. They're like, look, if I'm not, if I'm not going to benefit from it, why is my neighbor benefiting from it? This often happens. And so you have to really have like a holistic approach and kind of inclusive approach to make sure everyone has a seat at the table, not just the people immediately along the side of the forest, but on the periphery who
mm,
can mess up your plans as well. And you really have to have this, open-minded and an inclusive approach towards your stakeholders, because they could torpedo your project,
mm,
faster than you could blink. So that's certainly one of the problems, or one of the challenges that we've had to overcome, is that people don't want to be left out. And if you provide benefits to some, everyone else is going to want it. And you
mm,
need to figure out how are you going to sustainably distribute the benefits. And so that's one problem. The other problem is that, of course, the carbon markets is a marketplace, and prices go up and down. And should project prices, should carbon prices drop below a certain level, say $10, then you're gonna struggle to provide those programs to those people to keep the trees in the ground. So that's
mm,
another thing that you need to really be mindful of, is how you're going to structure your commercial agreements to ensure that you have at least a baseline price to keep the lights on and to keep the programs in place so that your trees don't get cut down. So
mm,
lots of different challenges, but fundamentally it's very rewarding because you're not only saving trees, you're actually improving livelihoods. The kids grow up, healthier, happier, more educated, and you're able to do this from your day job. It's very rewarding. I definitely
Mm,
enjoy getting up every morning, and I really am, grateful to be able to have an impact that's not only helping our planet but also helping people in very remote communities.
mm. It seems to me, Vahid, and I may be wrong, but of course the purpose is clearly there in the work that you do. It's very meaningful, and in the tangible results that these communities and the world receives are a very kind of cut and clear as to why you do the work that you do. But I sense as well that there's some sort of thrill for the adventure that seems to appeal to you personally, from the whole courting process, time spent in those shabby hotels, all the tea drinking and figuring out the nuances of the communities that you're working with, to as well the variables that come with the projects for years to come. Is that something that I'm sensing correctly, or is that not? Would that not be a way that you describe yourself as
No,
someone who's a bit
I mean,
adventurous?
definitely you're spot on. You're spot on, Corey. I mean, this work is not for the faint of heart. But if you're the type that likes to that's okay with discomfort, and that's okay with risk and exposing yourself to potentially very, very compromising situations, and then seeing what happens, then yeah, this is for you. So you really need to have that kind of Indiana Jones approach, because no, it is kind of an Indiana Jones lifestyle in that things could go terribly wrong and they could be very bad repercussions, but you have to just go for it and hope for the best. And I've been doing it for now 20 years, and so far so good. I'm still alive. I got all my fingers, no major diseases, and frankly, I'm a better man for it. So you do need to have an adventurous spirit to excel in this field. But if you do, it's a very rewarding line of work, and one which provides you with lots of anecdotes that you could tell your friends over drinks, over beers on the weekend.
Well, one thing that has really stuck with me, Vahid, I'm just so curious to ask. It seems like the family situation you had growing up, obviously wildly complex. Your family had to flee Iran, and it sounds like you ended up growing up in Canada. What were your parents like? Like, and why? How does that maybe connect your upbringing to what it is that you do now?
Yeah, well, good question. I think my parents were very much like firefighting mode. We came from a family of six children. So that's six mouths to feed, and you can't even speak the language. It's tough work. It's tough work. My mom had to do two jobs. I barely saw her. Culturally, it was very difficult, so they ended up getting separated, and so that made it even more complicated. So you didn't really have the support system in place to that you would typically expect. But I think that ultimately helped, you know, develop me into the person I am today, where I don't necessarily depend on a support system. I'm happy to fend for myself and to make the best of of difficult situations. And certainly that is kind of the reason why I have been able to excel in these difficult situations with very little support mechanisms. And I think that's definitely one of the factors that has made me the person I am today.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for sharing, Vahid. I really appreciate you taking the time with me here today. I want to be respectful of it. So before we wrap up, you mind if I ask you a couple rapid fire questions?
Yes, please.
Hey y'all, Corey here. We're going to take a quick break to hear a word from our sponsor. Being an entrepreneur is tough, especially when trying to run a business in a socially and environmentally conscious way. Having a community striving for the same type of impact makes the process easier. And knowing that others are reaching for the same goals is incredibly motivating. That's why our friends at Oliver Russell created the Social Good Network. The Social Good Network is designed to connect socially minded entrepreneurs and their employees with the community and tools they need to grow. The testimonials and reach that they've already seen have reiterated how much of a need there was for a community like this social good network. They've seen heartwarming testimonials, one on one connections, and engagement from over 10 countries so far. Visit socialgoodnetwork.com to create your profile today. Again, that's socialgoodnetwork.com. All right. So, first one for you. What's maybe a book, film, or other resource that impacted you recently, or maybe something you always come back to that you might recommend to our listeners?
Um, I read the Walt Disney movie, the Bob, I forget the name, but the CEO of Walt Disney um, wrote a autobiography of his time, 20 years that he was at ABC News, and then he was the CEO of Walt Disney. I thought that was a fascinating book about how you can effectively rise up the ranks of a global brand that's already very well established and to help it reinvent itself through the acquisition of Marvel Comics, Lucasfilms, and a number of other kind of brands that has enabled it to kind of thrive really through innovation. Now you have Disney Plus, which is also a streaming channel, and so it really taught me to embrace innovation. And so as soon as I started Blue Forest, I decided to really determine what are the most innovative remote sensing technologies to accelerate the mapping and the capturing of mangrove forests, and to using artificial intelligence and machine learning to accelerate how I could identify hotspots in deforestation, so as to always be on the cutting edge. Because if you're not innovating, you're going to be left behind.
Hmm. Hmm. Good recommendation. A next one for you. What's maybe one morning routine or daily habit that you absolutely have to stick to, if anything?
It's a hard work I do. It's honestly mentally draining, and I find what really helps is a morning jog. So I typically wake up at 6 o'clock and I go for a jog, and that's like turning on the engine. The morning jog for me is turning on the engine. By 6:45, the engine is raging, and so I just sit down from like 6 to 10. I do my best work, and then from 10 a.m. it's basically a downward cycle of productivity.
Well, it sounds like you've found your sweet spot, and I imagine that with everywhere you've been in the world across your life, that you've had some very satisfying morning jogs. So, a last one for you, Vahid, and this is, I guess, very specific to you. Of the 20 plus countries that you visited in Africa, what would be one that you'd recommend people should visit?
Okay, that's a hard question because indeed there's a lot of them. All of them
You
are
could do
unique.
you could do a top couple if you want.
Okay, well look, I think people typically they don't give enough credit to the countries in Africa. I think Africa has some stunning countries with beautiful nature, most kind, wonderful people, and so I would recommend exploring Kenya, which is a very soft landing for kind of people who've never been to Africa. Further afield, Uganda is a wonderful country, the kindest people, vast open horizons. Further north, you have Rwanda, which is like effectively like a bastion of sophistication and comforts within the African continent. If you're into Western Africa, the French-speaking countries, Cote d'Ivoire is beautiful, very sophisticated. You have the European cuisine and the flair with the African touch, which is just beautiful. If you're more into Latin and Portuguese, you're gonna love Mozambique and the colors, the spices, the kind of creativity and the passion that you find in a country like Mozambique. And so it really is, an amazing continent full of wonderful cultures, landscapes, cuisines that I highly recommend you visit.
Mm. Excellent. Great list. And I guess one final question here I want to make sure you get as well. What's one piece of advice that you might leave our listeners with? These folks are change makers and innovators from all sectors, all over the globe, looking to leave the world a better place than they found it. What might you part us with?
I would recommend what I've done myself, which is really go on the fringes of the marketplace where the market has yet to develop, and to be a first mover, to plant the seeds, to build the relationships, because that's how you're going to have long term growth and to be able to be really competitive. So find out whatever you're doing, find the markets that have the potential to develop and to grow, but that are not there, and just camp out there, spend time, you know, and do what I've done, and it will ultimately bear fruit.
Hmm. Unique and compelling advice for us to end on, Vahid. Where should folks keep up with you in Blue Forest? Where are the best places to follow along?
Yes, you can follow Blue Forest and myself on LinkedIn. That's where I'm probably most active. I'm also on Twitter, and Blue Forest also has an Instagram. And so, on all these three channels, you can keep up with our activities. Tomorrow is World Ocean Day. We'll be unveiling some stuff onto our socials, and yeah, we like to create a movement. And so, if you're interested in mangroves, get in touch. We'd love to hear from you.
Excellent. We'll have all things Blue Forest and you, Vahid, linked up in our show posts at socialentrepreneurship.fm and growensemble.com. Thanks so much, Vahid.
Thank you for having me, Corey. It's been great.